Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. In December 2011, a tidal wave of mass protests swept through the Russian capital and then engulfed scores of regions. These demonstrations came as a great shock to the Russian leadership, and it appeared that it was members of a rising middle class which were at the forefront of these protests against the regime. But do members of the middle class give more support to democratic values than members of other classes? And what is their relationship to the Putin regime? In this paper, I examine the political values of the Russian middle class, and in particular, middle class support for democracy. Now, when it comes to deciding who should belong to the middle class, there is little scholarly consensus. The widely different criteria which have been used to define it have resulted in huge disparities, with variations in its size in Russia between 20 and 60%. Economists tend to focus on income and property. However, defining the middle class by this method fails to explain how such a diverse group of individuals can develop a shared identity or class consciousness. Income-based approaches, I think, may be said to define middle stratums rather than middle classes. Now, sociologists, in contrast to economists, provide a much more comprehensive definition. So you'll see there that, for example, researchers at the Russian Institute of Sociology employ 4 criteria: income and property, occupation, education, and also self-identification. And those who fulfill all 4 of these criteria are said to belong to what is called the core of the middle class. And a person who meets at least 2 of these key criteria is a member of what they call the periphery. And as you can see on table 1 there, over the period 2003 to 2015, the size of the Russian middle class rose from 29 to 44%. The core rose from 11 to 18%, and the periphery from 18 to 26%. Now, a long-standing maxim postulates that there exists a dynamic correlation between the expansion of the middle class and political democratization. Pioneering works by Moore, Lipset, and Huntington, and many others, have stressed the vital role of the middle class in bringing about and sustaining democracy, as epitomized, of course, in Moore's famous declaration, "No bourgeoisie, no democracy." According to this theory, as the middle class accumulates wealth and property, it develops a vested interest in stability, the rule of law, and democratic procedures. And it quickly realizes that the best way to protect its newly acquired assets against the arbitrary behavior of an abusive and unchecked government is to place checks and balances on that government. Now, realizing its role as a catalyst for economic development, in 2008, the Putin regime called for an increase in the size of the middle class to encompass 60 or 70% of the Russian population by 2020. However, if the classic view of the modernization school holds, the Russian leadership's attempts to modernize the country in order to boost economic growth may sow the seeds of its own destruction. For according to modernization theory, as countries become more urban, more prosperous, and better educated, they're also more likely to democratize. Economic development alters the pyramid-shaped stratification system, in which the majority of the population is lower class and poor, to a diamond shape, in which the majority of the population is middle class and relatively well off. These changes, it is argued, inevitably lead middle class citizens in authoritarian regimes to push for democratic reforms, and once established, to protect and promote democratic values. Now, implicit in these assertions is the idea that the middle class holds a particular set of values and orientations that distinguish it both from its poorer and wealthier counterparts. And indeed, there is strong evidence to suggest that members of the global middle class give more support to democratic values than members of other classes. Thus, for example, a 13-nation study carried out by the Pew Organization in 2009, which included Russia, found that middle-class respondents gave the most support for free and fair elections, a fair judiciary, freedom of speech, press, and religion. But do middle classes everywhere and always support democratic values? Studies by Chinese scholars in particular have argued that the relationship between economic development and democratization can at best be characterized as a dynamic one. And a middle class's orientation towards democracy should not be taken as a given, but rather it will depend on a country's specific economic and political conditions, and also such factors as the middle class's level of economic security, its class cohesiveness, its dependence on the state, and its fear of political instability. When the middle class feels threatened, it will often support an authoritarian status quo. And for example, of course, the middle classes supported authoritarian regimes in Latin America in the 1970s. Likewise in China, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, they've propped up authoritarian regimes as long as their key economic interests were protected. And many, of course, have argued that it was the working class, not the middle class, that brought about universal suffrage. Now, one of the reasons why middle class support for democracy is not universal is the fact that it's not homogeneous. And it comprises a much wider group of citizens than Moore's idea of the bourgeoisie. Oops. So, for example, scholars studying the Chinese middle class have noted that there are 3 different channels through which individuals can obtain middle class status, and I think these are quite universal. Power-based executive access, which includes members of the ruling party, government officials, members of the civil service. We can have market-driven access, which includes private entrepreneurs and managers. Social network access, which includes professionals and cultural elites. And the scholar Li identifies 3 clusters within the Chinese middle class. He sees an economic cluster. You'll see there including private sector entrepreneurs, urban small business people, etc. You'll see a political cluster made up fundamentally of government officials, state sector managers and lawyers, and a cultural and educational cluster, academics, educators, media, etc. Now, members of these various groupings within the middle class can have different and sometimes conflicting interests, and they may act in widely divergent ways to protect these interests. So I would argue that if we're seeking to evaluate the part played by different social groups in Russia's transition, submerging them within the umbrella of the middle class is misleading, giving a coherence and a class consciousness to a group which may be far from united in its values. And an important factor here is the degree to which members of the middle class are tied to or independent of the state. And this has particular relevance for the Russian middle class. So whereas in the West the rise of the middle class was tied closely to the emergence of an independent business class and to the separation of economic and political power, the Russian middle class may be conceptualized as largely state-dependent. Thus, for example, Marieva in 2014, in her survey, showed that 68% of the members of the core of the middle class worked for the state, and only 13% worked in the private sector. The number of state officials, security officers, public sector managers and employees of state-owned companies within the middle class grew by 1/3 over the period 2007 to 2011. That's the most recent figures I have. Moreover, 76.6% of leading managers in the state sector were members of the middle class in 2011, compared to 1/3 of such individuals in 2007. And for members of the military and security forces, the percentage of the middle class members grew from 25% in 2007 to 44% in 2011 as Putin boosted their incomes. Now, turning to the political values of the middle class. When Russian citizens are asked, does Russia need democracy? The results consistently show high levels of support, usually around 50 to 60%. But what do Russians mean by democracy? The results of numerous polls demonstrate that a majority of citizens associate democracy much more with the provision of social justice, economic security, public order, than the classic values of liberal democracy. So here we can see some examples of this. As can be seen, when citizens were asked to choose between a list of future scenarios of the country, and they were allowed to choose more than one scenario, the top choice of the middle class, with 49% support, was the option social justice and a strong state which takes care of its citizens. 50% of the general population chose this option. In second place was the return of Russia to great power status. 35% of the middle class, 31% of the general population. Third place, a return to national traditions and time-tested moral values, which was supported by 34% of the middle class, just a little higher than the 32% of the general population. It's not until we come to the fourth option that we find support for human rights, democracy, and freedom of expression, which was supported by just 1/3 of the middle class and 27% of the general population. Likewise, another researcher at the Institute of Sociology, Peterhoff, found that in 2014, 75% of the members of the middle class expressed their support for the Putin regime, higher than the general population, 73%. Just under a quarter, though, 24%, agreed that the regime should be replaced, compared to 27% of the general population. Moreover, a majority of middle-class respondents, 52%, supported the view that Russia needs a strong hand to bring order to the country, compared to 59% of the general population. And less than half of the members of the middle class agreed that political freedom and democracy must be protected under all circumstances, 48% compared to 45% of the general population. And finally, as can be seen, 69% of the middle class gave priority to the concept of stability over reform, as did 70% of the general population. However, if we break these figures down by age, we see that the younger cohorts give greater support to democratic values. So, for instance, younger members below the age of 30 gave less support to the regime than those over the age of 40, 68% compared to 77%. They gave more support for its replacement, 31% to 23%. Less support for a strong hand, but still a majority, 51 to 55%. More support for democratic values, but still not a majority, 49 to 44%. And less support, bigger jump here, less support for stability over reform, 53 compared to 73%. Finally, Tikhanova has shown in numerous surveys conducted over the last 10 years that members of the middle class have an ambivalent attitude towards the role of political opposition. In 2014, 47% completely agreed that real democracy is impossible without a political opposition, so less than half. And 43% supported the view that the task of the opposition is not to criticise the government, but rather to provide help in its work. Now, it should be noted that these surveys were carried out after Russia's annexation of Crimea, when Russian patriotism and public support for Putin and the government was very high. However, surveys carried out over the last 10 years have consistently shown high levels of middle-class support for Putin and the Kremlin's party, United Russia. Indeed, United Russia promotes itself as a party of the middle class, and it draws substantial support from the middle class. According to a Eurobarometer survey, you can see, carried out in 2012, 48.6% of the upper members of the middle class supported United Russia in the Duma elections of 2011, higher than the general population, and 56.9% voted for Putin in 2012, again higher than those in the survey of the general population. Now, all of these surveys discussed above examine the values of the middle class as a whole and do not take into account these different values of the different sectors of the middle class. Unfortunately, I can only find one survey which has looked at the values of the different sectors, which was carried out by Makarenko in 2010. But its conclusions are based on 120 interviews rather than a mass survey. But this study found that the demand for democracy was more pronounced amongst the intelligentsia and managers of some large companies, whilst members of small businesses demonstrated lower interest in democratization, as did government employees, particularly in Moscow, where support was at its lowest. I think much more work needs to be done. I'm trying to do this kind of work myself, to look at the values of different sectors of the middle class. Okay, in conclusion, members of the Russian middle class, and particularly the younger generation, express greater degrees of support than members of the wider population for some democratic values. But in many cases, the differences are not great, and like the general population, most members of the middle class prioritize stability and economic security over democratic freedoms. In addition, a majority support the view that Russia needs a strong hand, and as we've seen, members of the middle class give more support to United Russia and the Putin regime than members of the general population. These views are understandable, given Russia's turbulent post-communist history. Putin has been able to play on the fears of Russian citizens that any change of leadership will inevitably lead the country back to the horrors of the Yeltsin era. However, as we've seen, the middle class is not a cohesive body, and the different occupational and generational strata within it are far from united in their values. Some members of the entrepreneurial middle class have become resentful of government policies which favour massive concentrations of investment in the oil and gas sectors, where corporate relations between business and the state are at their most insidious. Others, particularly members of the intelligentsia and cultural sectors of the middle class, are deeply worried about high levels of corruption, the erosion of civil liberties, the lack of an independent judiciary, and free and fair systems of elections. And they are no longer willing to abide by the informal social contract between the regime and society, which commits them to give their tacit support to the government in return for the delivery of stability and economic reforms. Here it would appear that some of these citizens have now adopted what Engelhardt terms post-materialist values. Yet others, primarily senior managers in the state bureaucracy and other state sector employees, may feel they have more to lose with a change of regime. After returning to the presidency in 2012, Putin signed the May decrees, which called for substantial annual increases in the wage of large numbers of state employees. However, Russia has recently faced a deep economic recession, and the middle classes are beginning to feel the pinch. Currently, the Ukrainian factor is keeping Putin's popular support very high, but that may not last. The most worrying scenario for the regime would be the creation of a unified protest movement comprising a coalition of younger, more radical elements of the middle class and members of the working class. Up until now, we've seen two disparate movements: working class protests that have primarily been concerned with bread and butter issues and middle-class protests which have been more overtly political in nature. If these two protest movements are able to come together and act in concert, they will pose a much more serious challenge to the Putin regime than the uprisings of 2011-13. However, a more likely scenario suggested by this analysis is that the regime will continue to gain the support of a majority of the members of the middle class, who on their past record are much more likely to opt for the status quo over the uncertainties of regime change and revolutionary upheavals. In conclusion, the existence of a middle class will not ensure a democratic outcome. It will depend on such factors as its origins, its size, its cohesiveness, its sense of economic security, and crucially its relationship to the state. The interaction of these factors will have a major effect on its behaviour, which can be reformist if its interests are threatened by the state, or conservative and supportive of the status quo if its interests are protected by the state. Thank you.